movement while the new museum is being built. This space he's called OCMAExpand-Santa Ana. And so this is one component of that larger project, that larger goal. And this moment for the museum to really be, as I've explained a little bit, reassessing our role in this community, reaching new audiences, challenging ourselves to think about what role the museum can have for our community and how we can really push ourselves to be creative and think about that in an expansive way. Another important focus of OCMA-Expand is this idea of OCMA's focus on California and the Pacific Rim, and that's a really important feature. And the other key element of this space is these kind of core ideas that I've developed about the way this space works as a kind of laboratory of experimentation. In a way, one of the ways that I've been thinking of the exhibitions that I'm programming for this space is almost like taking this idea of our museum focusing on California and the Pacific Rim as a research question. So for me, as a curator, artists are often a way that I look to kind of solve questions or maybe create more questions even, but to think through the complexity of what that means. Because I think it is actually quite complex, this idea of our focus culturally in Southern California on this geographical region of the world. And so with that in mind, we developed the program here for OCMA-Expand to look at emerging artists from this California and the Pacific Rim region, and they will be diverse across the board through either the 5 or 6 seasons that we have here. Each of those seasons, like I have explained a little bit before, will be 6 months in duration. And I'm deliberately working with artists or selecting artists who kind of push against the traditional ways of working in a museum space. So the exhibitions are on display for longer periods of time, but within that 6-month period of time, things will evolve and change. And so many of these artists work more with socially engaged practices. The work itself might physically shift and evolve, and we'll see all of this when we go into the gallery. And there are also important performance and events that are part of the exhibition, as much as the objects that you'll see on display. And so I really hope that that kind of dynamic energy is something that will keep people coming back. When you're bringing visitors through, that's an important thing to point out. So again, this idea of a kind of laboratory for experimentation. My goal is really to create a very energetic, dynamic, kind of exploratory time here for us as a museum. So we'll see how it works. It's a big experiment in many ways, but I'm excited to share with you. Some of the exhibitions are straight up like photography and more traditional. So there is something for everyone. Not everything is, changing and moving and performative, but so there's a really broad range of things. Some things are more political, some things are less. We'll get into it when we get there. The other thing I'll point out to you is the model of the new building. As far as I understand, it will actually have a case over it at some point soon, particularly by the time we have students here, but don't hold me to that. These are the renderings that are on display at the moment. That does not necessarily mean that there will not be other renderings. I'm not, this area of the lobby is, other people are responsible for kind of this area of the space, so I'm not actually sure what else is going to happen in these other spaces. There might be more information about the past, the history of the museum, or the collection, or other elements of OCMA-Expand and different things moving forward. We will have a little retail shop with books that will be in this area. So this is still a work in progress. One thing I should mention as I'm talking, I had mentioned this a couple of times. I know Shamin has mentioned it in all of the emails that she sent, but just so everyone's clear, we did open with a soft opening on Saturday, but our big public opening is November 3rd. So we're kind of taking this month of October to work out some kinks and figure out, finishing touches. For example, there'll be a door to that space that we started in this morning. All of that stuff is coming. and will be in place by November. Just to also let you know what it is you're looking at there, you have the checklist, but you also have the text that I wrote about each exhibition, and there will be some kind of printed element that visitors will receive that will contain that information. So originally I wrote this thinking we were going to have a more simple brochure that visitors would carry along with the map, and some of that is evolving still. But the text is done, and the text is there, and that I don't think will change at all. Any questions before we go in? Okay. Yes?
Will docents have an opportunity to do that virtual reality thing?
I don't know.
That was incredible.
I know that they had talked about at the gala, Morphosis Architects they've been working with virtual reality, and our museum is the first time they've used virtual reality to actually design the building. So for the gala, they had a whole setup, but it's a lot of very expensive technology that we don't have and belongs to the architects.
And people didn't like to mess up their hair, so it's
a little bit cumbersome, but also very cool. So the answer is that I don't know, but I think they might be working on some element of that.
Oh, I hope so.
So let's go ahead in here, and actually with Rodrigo's work, I'm just going to give you a few minutes to look around, and we'll meet on the other side of the stairs. So take a few minutes just to look carefully and think about and just take in what it is we're actually looking at.
Have we heard anything about the sculpture? Is that a grand sculpture?
No, it's completely hypothetical.
Okay.
Do you know if the reflective videos, if it's easy to join them into one later?
We haven't done the joining part, so what I've been doing is I try not to break them up.
Okay.
But if we need to, then we need to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look carefully and see if you can figure out what he's doing. Help me made these. What do you think they're made of?
So did
Tricky.
This is Rodrigo Valenzuela.
Who is it?
Rodrigo Valenzuela. The checklist is on the back of the sheet. I think he's at the bottom. I think it might be alphabetical. Oh, here we go. Now we're sorry, there are two checklists. It's on the first checklist.
When you started looking at these.
Wait, let's start all over. Is it on this thing?
Yes.
What's coming forward, what's receding, so is there a bad corner where the floor and the ceiling be done? But now, as I look at it, I'm seeing that I'm seeing more than one place that they're
Yeah.
so that's happening.
Yeah. So the sense of space is really tricky to decipher, right?
Yeah.
When I first looked at it on Saturday, there didn't look like there was any depth, but now I see, because you can see where a floor is, or at least what is supposed to be a floor.
I just said that it reminded me of Escher.
Yeah.
The continuous there, and the other one where you have, what is it that you have three parallelepipeds, and then they can look at something else. Yeah, this is not.
Yeah. Well, the optical illusion, the depth of space.
It's disturbing the.
So what was that like for you as a viewer when you were looking at these? A little bit disconcerting, was it?
It's shocking.
No, you're shaking your head no?
There's a little bit of a shock when you first come in, especially when you see like the big black X on the white. But there's kind of a little bit of a shock because it's so strong. The black on white just is a little bit shocking at first.
Yeah.
My very first.
Well, it is, very deliberately black and white, and so that color, does it remind you of anything?
Franz Klein. Yes.
Franz Klein, yeah, exactly, yeah.
When I was a little girl, I had to go to work with my dad. He built boats.
Ah.
And it reminds me of being in the workshop where the
Interesting.
construction, not the actual hulls, but the things that the hulls were built.
Okay, those are both really amazing observations, and we're going to hold on to those and get back to it because I just want to see if there's any other observations anyone had about their experience of looking. Yeah.
I see in the background like small bricks, which shows an immensity of the object.
Interesting that you say bricks. What made you say bricks?
Because it looks like it's just bricks.
Yeah, the texture of it. Okay, so I'm asking you all these questions because this element of process and actually labor, that's why, Linda, I think your point is so interesting, are really key elements of this work for Rodrigo. He is an artist who was born in Chile. He came to the United States, as he was studying art, and he worked in construction, building like buildings and homes and all of those things. And those experiences very much influenced his art practice. So he's a student studying Franz Klein, studying abstract expressionism, studying all these things, but working as a laborer in order to support himself through school. So that's why I think those two observations simultaneously are really actually like kind of the crux of what this is about. He's made many different kinds of works of art. The other, we'll get to the video component as well. But for him, this idea of kind of playing with his viewer's experience of how he makes, what he makes, is a really key element of the work. So I was interested that someone said it was a little bit frustrating, but also maybe gratifying in that moment of deciphering, right? He really wants you to kind of take time and try and unpack what it is that he's done. Because what he has done, and I will give you the background, and the bricks, the reason I'm asking about the bricks is he often uses clay to create a kind of backdrop. So he works in his studio, and he creates almost like a stage set, starting with the clay to cover all the walls or all the kind of backdrop areas. And then these elements that he's using that are kind of sculpture are made of graphite and plaster that he mixes together. In this particular body of work, he is very much, the American type is really a response to abstract expressionism. And so he's trying to kind of make these sculpture elements that when photographed, when they become flattened, when they're photographed as prints, have a kind of reminiscent of that kind of gestural mark of abstract expressionist paintings like Franz Klein.
Can you define, maybe a couple of sentences, abstract expressionism?
Sure. And just to kind of contextualize it, so the other kind of key element to this work and this moment was, post-war American art was this moment when artists were, was a group of painters that were working in moving towards abstraction, but it was really about the sort of their physical presence as artists in front of the canvas, the gestural mark of the sort of quote-unquote master genius artist's hand. And it wasn't, and Clement Greenberg was an important art critic at the moment who really defined this period in art history, and it was this moment of the beginning of art for art's sake. The gesture itself, the paint on the canvas, was about nothing more than that thing itself, than the paint on the canvas and that sort of gesture and mark and feeling of the artist itself. And there was this, that was a big shift. It wasn't the mark that represented something in the world. It wasn't representing even politics or ideas necessarily, but it was really about supporting that really kind of, in a sense, kind of essentialized ideal. So Rodrigo was always fascinated by that because he comes from a background where everything is political, art and culture and all of those things. You can't just make a mark and it doesn't have a broader context and meaning interpretation. So he always struggled with that reading of abstract expressionist art. For him, it was very frustrating. And this moment in the 1950s in American history was also a moment where the US was growing economically, their influence and power around the world was becoming greater and stronger. And in Rodrigo's mind, there was the kind of American ideal that was oversimplified in a way, a sort of apple pie American suburban life that was becoming a kind of global model of culture around the world. And for him, that idea that it was okay for culture to lack a kind of complexity and rigor sort of starts in that moment in the 1950s in American culture, which he connects to that painting being, what you see is what you get. That sort of essential idea of paint and canvas, and it's okay to just really think about only that. Because for Rodrigo, he doesn't necessarily agree with that. So he's kind of taking those forms and those gestures and making his version of an American type. Yes?
Excuse me. I don't know if you can answer this question, but when he puts these together, this graphite plaster, is he leaning this? Is this a balance?
Yeah, I didn't get to finish the physical explanation of it because I got this question, so let me get back to that. Yes, so I was going to go into explaining his process. And so for him, he creates this experience for the viewer that is a little bit hard to decipher exactly what the process is. So he sets up in his studio this clay backdrop and these sculptural elements that he then photographs. And he makes a very big print and he hangs it in the back of the studio space. And then he does it again. So he sets up another setup that is, with the clay and the back and the floor. And there are also these bits of wire and metal and the other sculptural elements. And they're all very precariously balanced in relationship to each other. He deliberately uses the plaster and the graphite because it has this kind of chalky quality, but is also very sculptural as well. And then, as you'll see, they're framed without any glass, so that matte surface is also really important to him. So it's the image within an image, and sometimes you can really see where the horizon, or like the floor meets the wall.
More than one.
Yeah. And one of the questions I have for him, if it's only twice in each one, I actually realize I need to confirm that with him.
So there's another...
At a certain point, I often give up actually trying to figure out exactly where the floor starts and the wall starts. I don't know that that's crucial. But what is crucial is to understand that everything you're seeing in this photograph was extremely labor-intensive to create. So each of these plaster things that he made by hand, and they're actually, molded and cast, and then precariously set, and then photographed and rephotographed, and then he prints them all himself, and he makes the frames, and all of those things are actually really important to him, to the point of every element being kind of part of the object and his own labor that it represents.
Is there an aperture underneath the plaster because it looks like if the plaster's strong enough to be in those long...
It might be. It might be.
Yeah,
I mean, it only has to be... I think maybe not, because he did talk at one point about setting things up for a shot and then everything falling and him having to redo it. Yeah. At the end of all the, these plaster bricks don't exist anymore, by the way. Now that he's photographed them and they've broken and whatever, they get thrown out too. Yeah.
Is the texture of the background clay? Is that the clay?
The white is the clay, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And he's yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I guess I'm not getting what you mean when you say he photographs and then he re-photographs.
So you know how it's kind of hard to decipher? Let's look at another one that might be. So you can see right here the floor, right?
Yes. Yes.
But then you also see it again right here.
Yeah.
Oh, I
so
see.
This part was the first photograph, and then that became the backdrop, and then he set up another kind of sculptural environment in front of that big blow-up photograph, and then re-photographed it.
Okay. Does the original big one?
Does he
he's photographing photograph.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's the trick.
So he makes a large photograph and then rephotographs. Does the original large ones still exist? What happens with that?
That's a good question. I don't know. Everything he does is working towards this final product.
Yeah.
So I don't know that he would consider that. It might still exist, but the artwork is this, not the backdrop. He might.
In another.
He's worked. He has done other bodies of work. There was another series he did that the clay was black, and the objects in front of it were white. So I mean, he's worked in this way in many other series. If you look back and do research his work, yeah.
What is the scale of the black sculptural elements? How large are those?
That's a good question. They're almost like human size.
Okay.
Oh, are they?
Yeah. I mean, they're smaller here when they're photographed and kind of condensed. And he's playing with, I mean, other ideas that are important to abstract expressionism is the very conscious acknowledgement of the surface of the painting. That was something that abstract expressionist painters were very concerned about, right? Jackson Pollock famously put his paintings on the floor and walked around them. And so the body in relationship to the paintings were always really important for abstract expressionists. And so Rodrigo is kind of acknowledging that as well. He's very conscious of the frame of this photograph being also kind of human scale so that it's big enough for you to kind of get lost in it, but also big enough for you to kind of have your own point of view and kind of also kind of exert some of your own power as a viewer over what you're interpreting, versus the abstract expressionists that kind of, you know, were larger scale and kind of loomed over the visitor in an interesting way. Yes, Shimon?
So he doesn't want us to read any social political context into what he's doing, right? Or
absolutely, 1,000% social political content in everything he's doing.
Yeah.
In fact, so maybe I haven't been clear enough, but I'm trying to be diplomatic. He is extremely critical of the American idea that art should not be complex and culturally critical. In fact, this idea of, you know, art for art's sake for him is almost like, it's like so wrong that he feels like art is always political. There's always a critique of the way he, as a cultural worker and making art, it has to be about something. It has to be. So he had a really hard time where he was, you know, taught as an art student thinking about painting for the sake of painting's sake, because for him, he makes art because he really wants to make a comment about the world that we live in. And he's very much wanting to suggest that we should be thinking critically. We should be questioning things and not just taking something for face value, like an easy soundbite that's simple and straightforward, and, you know, just to sort of accept that for what it is. He wants us to question why we would just accept something that might be simple and easily digestible, because we particularly live in a moment where, you know, I think it's important to challenge and think about the complexity of everyone's, you know.
So is this then saying something about pay attention to how we can alter images to be fooled by them? Is it about,
you know, fooled, but I definitely think it's wanting you to kind of do some work in how you're looking and taking something in. Okay. That it's not necessarily easy. That's kind of why I asked you guys to, before I said anything, to spend some time looking and to think about how that felt for you. Because it's not, these aren't, like all of those things that I just told you are not obviously in this work. But once you see it and start to look for it, and we can look at other ones too. I mean, some are a lot more kind of minimal or kind of, I hesitate to use the word simple, but simplified in their composition and their sort of form. But again, he's trying to give you clues about how hard it was to physically make and do what he did. And so on the surface, they might just look like, you know, black and white photographs, not a big deal. But if you take the time to look and to kind of tease out all of the details in his process, there's complexity there. Or at least he hopes that you get a sense of some of that complexity.
I didn't see them as photographs at first. I thought they were paintings. So that already there, it's an element of distortion.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's really challenging you to try it. And it is, I think, as a viewer, and I think as docents, these are complex works, and they're not always going to be easy for all of our visitors. I think particularly like with young people, we can even start with this idea of, you know, why would the artist make this thing that is hard to decipher? What is he trying to get you to think about? And he's trying to make you conscious of your own way of observing, your own way of interpreting and pulling meaning out of things. So you can't just assume that this is something simple, that actually if you take the time to look closely and think about that it all has meaning, every element of it has meaning, the way it's made, the way it's, the composition, all of those things, there's complexity in that, and that's what Rodrigo's really interested in. Now, let's go look at the video piece because I think that'll also add a little bit of context for you guys.
Will he be here on the 2nd?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he can answer some questions on the 2nd.
On the surface? Sign anything.
You might sign on the back, but the surface of the work is like
It's distracting.
Yeah, I don't think he really cares about any of that. Remember how we're doing the access expression piece? You're trying to replicate. Oh, I said that. It's made of graphite and polyester. And specifically graphite, which is a tool. So, the sound of this video, I'll let you watch it. Coming close to the speakers and here. It's quiet. You can. Just listen for a minute. It's not a very long video.
Y ello que está haciendo. Yo digo al mundo ladrón desde afuera. Desde dentro es una ficción poetizada. No hay orientación casual, un momento singular donde la esencia sea habitual. La diferencia es que no puede hacer cada cosa. Siempre la cosa pasa. No hay poder más en esta casa. Las cosas. El mundo no necesita completamente. Cada forma de un objeto tiene esa apertura bajo la otra. Un lugar pequeño de su origen. En la cabeza otra ciudad. Yo, adyacente y distante a la vez. Cada posición. El cuerpo está entablando una relación con otro, como si fuéramos hermanos sobrinos primos que producen nada familia. Nos extrañamos más con cada conexión, sobre el nivel de apariencia y la presencia visual de nuestras similitudes, corrigiendo una diferencia muy buena de partes.
It's kind of hypnotic, and I find it to be tricky to hear exactly what he's saying. He's very deliberately speaking in a kind of hushed, whispered tone. It's almost as if he's like talking in your ear, like whispering in your ear. You'll hear that the language gets a little bit more rapid as the video goes on, as does the camera movement. The title of the piece is Tertiary, and it's referring to, in a film, the tertiary characters are the characters that are key to the plot, to the story, but are not given a name, a character name. So for him, it's a metaphor for the immigrant's experience. This idea that immigrants are here in our culture, but sometimes not named or acknowledged, sometimes in very close proximity, working alongside us, and often not, recognized or named in a way that maybe like, I don't know, pioneers character might be. And so all of the elements of the way the camera moves, the way the language is, it's in Spanish. This is Rodrigo speaking also. And I have watched this video 12, 15 times. It's very hard to retain the actual message of the language. And I asked him about that, and he said that is also deliberate. Maybe it's just me, and maybe it's the fact that I'm reading it and hearing him speak in Spanish, and that simultaneous kind of processing of information. But I find it hard to kind of grasp what he's saying in a really concrete way. So I think that sense of abstraction, that sort of distance, even though it's right there, is kind of what the piece is about. And so he and I, we were talking about, this new body of work that he very much wanted to show, and then he has a kind of parallel practice in photography and video work. The video work is, more straightforward. The photography is usually more abstract, whereas the video work is, representational in that it shows, humans and language and those kinds of things. I wouldn't go so far to say it's more narrative, but maybe a little bit. But I did think they were a nice pairing because I hope that in combination, these two works do give you a sense of, to answer your question, Shimon, I don't think you can see this video and then know that the same artist made these photographs and not think that there's political content that is at the core of the work. Does that make sense? Questions? Thoughts?
¿A dónde voy después? Que la pregunta cada vez es sobre menos.
So the writing is on purpose? The title of all these writings is on purpose so that...
Of course, yeah.
So that...
There's subtitles so that people who don't...
Like we don't listen or we don't read, we just observe. Is that what the whole idea is?
No, not exactly. I mean, there's subtitles, they're translation of what he's saying. So he's giving you some access to the words that he's saying. And it is indeed meaningful. I mean, there are lots of different, it's almost like a poem. Yeah. And so it's a very abstract kind of text that he's reading to us or reciting. And they very specifically, create how there's relationships between even the shadows and the light and the way you can see people's faces or not. And you almost get a glimpse of someone, but then it moves away. So all of that is very interesting.
So because these are people who are immigrants whose work we need to have done, but don't give them names in many cases, right? And we have this work that celebrates the hard work that's being done.
Yeah.
Is that part of what he wants us to talk about? Yeah. We need to acknowledge all this work that is getting done and we're not paying attention.
Exactly.
It's not too simple to say.
It's not. Okay. I will say, by the way, these are all actors. These are all actors who have played tertiary characters in film. So they could be immigrants. Yeah. But they're all people who have been these tertiary characters that are in films or whatever, but don't get named. Yeah, I mean, it's a questioning where people get acknowledged, where labor gets acknowledged, and as an artist, for him, having had the experience as a laborer, he feels like his kind of privileged position to work as an artist, the fact of his labor is, for him, it's a core part of what he does. What were you going to say?
Well, I need to take a position that's very different.
Yeah.
But a few of us...
I love it. Take a position.
Just a few of us finished a book called Absolutely. I walk around this gallery, all I see is someone playing with perspective. And looking at different ways of drawing the near to you and the far from you. And it seems very simplistic. So in that way, if that was part of what he was doing, then along the same lines of the tertiary, we collectively are unacknowledged tertiary parts of his art.
Yeah.
Now I can come in and I can tell people what to look for, and they can either agree with me or tell me, well, I'm not sure I see that, but okay. I certainly don't think he got his point across if that was, without explanation.
Well, I think...
Other than the abstract expressionism as you described it, I thought was very good, because that's what it looks like. It's like here's some tools.
Well, and I think so the labor is a key point, but I think the complexity and the kind of multiple readings is a really key point for him as well. He's not one of the challenges for me, and you'll read what I wrote about it, was pinning down what the work was about. Because, first of all, it's a brand new body of work, and I think he's still working out what it's about. But we had so many conversations, and it's actually, in some ways, about so many of these different things. And the kind of, another thing we talked about, as a photographer, he's very conscious of, and also in the video artist, the sort of position of the camera. and the viewer, the subjectivity of the viewer relative to that. And so he's creating, and he's very conscious of this. I mean, that's another important element when you study abstract expressionism, that idea of the subject and the sort of viewer subject that wasn't in the 50s considered this very sort of typical, essentialized, probably white male subject. Rodrigo is very much pushing against that and kind of challenging our idea that we could ever assume there's only ever one subject. And it's this kind of opening up of how complicated it is and how we can't make that assumption that anyone's going to see the same thing in these works, even that he sees or that anyone else sees or that we tell them to see. So all of that is there, and I think all of those different points of view are what, to me at least, makes it so interesting. Now, I acknowledge that for all of us as docents and teachers, there's a lot here, and we'll get into like how much time you'll have with the school groups or whatever with this, but I would just advise you to feel like you don't have to tell everyone everything. You just sort of pick the one part of it that feels interesting to you and try and have a rich conversation about that one thing about it, or whatever, how much you want to take on. So we have 6 more shows to see, so let's get going.
A little fast.
If anyone wants to take the elevator, it's around there. We'll start with this exhibition around the stairs up here. So just the elevator is right there around to the right, and it will let you out right up here, and we'll be right up here.
For the video, that's right.
What time is this supposed to be over?
Well, I think around 1:30, so we need to cut out at 12:30.
This has to be over at 1:30? This is going to 1:30?
Yes. No, not the Wall Street. I'm talking about, but there's lunch.
Yeah,
and
which
then
time is lunch?
around 11:30.
Okay. And then I saw they moved it back to 1 o'clock. This week 1:30. How pretty.
It's all around the stairs, not here. The artist is Mariángeles Soto-Diaz. She's actually based, she's a local artist, lives here in Irvine, teaches at UCI. She was actually trained as a painter and worked a lot in her schooling originally in abstraction. But as her practice has evolved, it's moved away from sort of art object and into the what is commonly referred to as social practice. So we have let's kind of come over this way a little bit. But when I invited her to participate in this exhibition, there were actually other projects that she had been working on that I thought she might adapt to this space. But she proposed taking on this whole new body of work that she's just kind of pulled together for us here. And it started with her experience as a child. She actually grew up in Venezuela, and at the age of 3, because she has a little brother, she started practicing judo. She was a little girl and spent her entire childhood into her teens, until she was 17, doing judo. And she rose to the level of having attained her brown belt. And there was this opportunity for her to go on and get the black belt, and she had a kind of crisis, feeling like she didn't deserve that kind of mastery level, and questioning for herself what it meant to kind of have that designation and the kind of symbolism of it. And because for judo, and in her studies of judo and the way she was taught, it's as much a kind of philosophical training as a physical training. And so she became very interested as a young woman in Buddhist teachings and things, and so she decided before she would test for her black belt, she was going to go to Japan, and then because she was a woman, she was dissuaded from going to Japan by herself. And she ended up in Northern California, where she went to study Buddhism there at a monastery, and she was on a path to even become a Buddhist nun. And then she met her husband, and her life evolved, and she ended up going to art school and changing her path. But for decades, she has wanted to return to the practice of judo because it was something that has always been so informative to her way of thinking about the world. And so as she's been, we're, I think, living in a particularly charged moment, and there's lots of, for her, all the politics and cultural kind of challenges that we're facing today, she's found herself thinking about some of those lessons that were ingrained in her early on that are rooted in her judo practice. So she's in her 40s, and she's decided to retrain herself in judo. So she's not only going back and thinking about the philosophical ideas of judo, which, yes, they're a martial art, but it's very much about deflecting. So when there's a force that kind of comes at you that can feel maybe violent or oppressive, to kind of use that force back on something. And for her, that's a really interesting metaphor for how to grapple with everyday challenges that we're dealing with, that we deal with in our life. So she's also training physically. She's working with a dojo here locally in Costa Mesa. And throughout the run of the exhibition, she will be doing different performances and events and things, training here and practicing. Visitors are also invited to join her in taking on a challenge. One key element of this project is you'll see there's a couple labels, and these are kind of dojo corners. And over the course of the show, she's inviting any visitors over this 6 months to take on any challenge that you or anyone might like to commit to, practicing a daily, weekly, kind of regular challenge. And to document this challenge and then post pictures too. There's an Instagram account that she's created, so there'll be this sort of online presence that will simultaneously be connected. So there are a number of different elements to the exhibition. She'll be organizing a series of events and performances. The first one we're doing in November is a series of film screenings in collaboration with the Latin American Studies Department at UCI, and some other filmmakers dealing with the gender politics of martial arts. So there's a very strong kind of feminist critique to this work, I would say, as well, because so much of her own experience as a woman practicing martial arts was so challenging. The other elements, the kind of formal elements of the work that I'll explain are these coils. And there's two, so she's really responding in this space also to the kind of the ideas of judo and this sort of sense of balance and that dynamic of energy between two kind of opposing forces. So she's playing with that a lot in the kind of way she's designed the exhibition space. The coil for her, obviously it references the hierarchy of the different levels of judo, starting with the white to the yellow to the orange and the gray and the blue. But the coil also has this kind of unfolding and this sense of growth. And for her, that's really important. That kind of cycle also is represented. You'll notice the colors don't just go in this order, but they start with the black to the brown to the blue to the orange to the yellow, and then they go down to the white and then back up again. So it's this very deliberate rise and fall of that hierarchy. I'll tell you a little bit about the works in this corner as well, around here. So when I mentioned there are certain things that are going to keep evolving over time, this is one of those areas. She's also really interested in playing up, there's the hard edge, right, of the lines of the mats, and the mat itself becomes kind of like a formal element. They're very deliberately, apparently in judo dojos, this form of the 2 meter by 1 meter mat is a standard form. And so she's using that as a kind of formal organizer of the installation. In contrast with that, and the kind of, that hard-edged line, she's this kind of area and some of these works on linen that are adding a kind of sort of a softer edge. So this is meant, she hand drew these little graphite circles that reference a kind of artist studio and pegboard space. And over the course of the show, she's going to be accumulating everything from photographs and documentation of herself practicing, different events and programs that we do. I'm not exactly sure actually even what that will look like yet, but there are also different writings and texts that are, rooted in the sort of history and beginnings or foundations of the philosophies of judo that she's been researching that will sort of make their way in here. So this is a nice little beginning point to even get at some of those ideas, like if you're bringing visitors through to kind of, you can talk about mind over muscle, like locks and grappling, and this idea of pushing and pulling that tension. Yes, Jennifer.
You're doing a great job, by the way. It looks amazing here. I have to tell you though, when I walked in, I immediately thought of Mass Mocha and saw the wit with these wall panels.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't think she would be upset by that. In fact, I think at one point when we were talking about like the tone of it, she kind of referenced all of it. I don't think there's like a meaningful relationship for her in that connection, but it's not outside of her thinking.
I mean, if we get asked about it.
Yeah, I don't know how, we'd have to think a little bit about like conceptually how you connect those things. I mean, I think for her, the idea of the exhibition space as a kind of conceptual frame for the work.
Tying the painting together with how I see how the colors are right on top of each other, like you say. They're just in order of that painting, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in a different way, I mean, this particular, the mural or wall painting are very much in response to this site. So they're site responsive. So I don't think, for example, they could exist somewhere else. It's not this sort of concept and the way that Solowit would like, sort of give you a score for whatever he would make. So it's a little different in that.
So the wall panels were made to kind of work with these works, particular works, right?
Yeah, and to create an experience for the viewer here in this specific place.
Okay.
The other thing I'll point out though with these works is they're very deliberately hand-drawn with gouache on linen. So she could have made these spiral paintings with hard lines and taped off the edges, but she chose not to because she's trying to kind of remind you, even the way it's stretched, it's kind of loosely stretched the linen over the canvas so there's a softness to it. So it's a kind of contrast, right, between the mats and the kind of geometry of that. And again, it's about this sort of back and forth and push and pull. And even with like the arrows, they're not necessarily perfect, but I think for her, those soft edges are really important. There's another painting on the opposite end on that wall that kind of speaks to that as well. Yeah, so there's two coils. Yeah, they're all judo belts, yeah.
It's beautiful, I love it. It's like very perfect. It's soft, it's great.
There are two paintings. One is there and there, and then there are two other coils. Yeah. Let's go. Yeah, these are all made of judo belts. Yeah.
That's why the thickness also is such, because the judo belts are about this.
Any other questions about Mariángeles' project? And this will again be one like things will grow over time. She'll be doing different performances and activities. She might be here practicing. Take a minute, you can read the labels. Maybe you guys want to participate and take on a challenge, or you can always, when you give public tours, to make sure you share that element with visitors and invite them to engage with that as well. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we'll move on.
So did she pick the walls as well?
No, our staff picked the walls. So this exhibition is by a young artist from Guadalajara, Mexico, Valentina Jager. I discovered Valentina's work last year, actually, when I was in Mexico City. And she works as an artist and with installation, but she also is a writer. She's actually about to start a PhD program in creative writing in Spanish in Houston, which is the first PhD program of its kind in the world in Spanish, PhD in creative writing. So she kind of has these two kind of parallel career paths. She's working quite a bit as an artist, but she also this sort of writing element, that a lot of her writing takes the form of like plays and kind of dramatic performance events. So in January, we're also going to be having a performance that she's organized as well, and that will actually, we're hoping we can do it outside here. I don't know if you've been to where the corner bakery is, but there's a big grassy area there. So we're hoping to have the performance that she's going to do out there. We're considering 2 performances, one in English and one in Spanish, because the original text was written in Spanish, but we want it to also be accessible for people here. And that performance is called The Incredible Shrinking Mercury, and it's very funny anyway, about this idea of Mercury in retrograde and how we like to kind of use it as an excuse for everything going wrong, but actually, and so all the sort of more esoteric philosophy around that versus the scientific idea of how Mercury actually moves in the universe, and that idea of retrograde is not scientifically accurate the way it's described in astrology. So it's sort of these kind of ideas about time and science versus like philosophy, and so those ideas are also present in this work. Questions about time and the sort of subjectivity of memory and the precariousness of how we interpret things. So before I tell you, I mean, I've told some of you a little bit about these works, but I'll let you kind of just experience a little bit of the work, and we'll kind of move and chat. They are tissue paper.
They kind of remind me of those the sounds that they cut out that one time kids.
They're very fragile. Yeah. Clearly these are, these sort of fragile, delicate. And when I saw that, I was just first drawn to, there's something delightful about their colors and their geometries. And then I learned where the imagery came from, which was originally for her inspired by images that are very common in the newspaper in Mexico, the violence that occurs, based on, all the sort of drug cartels and how common and sort of regular that is to sort of see in the newspaper. And it kind of took me by surprise, because there are these sort of somewhat kind of vibrant colors and this kind of fragile lusciousness of the surface. And so that juxtaposition to me felt kind of surprising and shocking, and I was really fascinated by that idea.
And then in talking with, what did you say that inspired by what images in the newspaper?
Images of like dead bodies and violence that happens, and it's very common in Mexico to like open the newspaper and see, murders that have happened or different things like that, and they, and that there's this sense of desensitization that people kind of just accept that and don't find that to be so necessarily as horrific or shocking as we might. But the other element of this work, so she's sort of looking at the abstract forms of those bodies that she sees in images and further abstracting them and kind of pulling them out of any kind of ground. And she's creating these abstractions that reference bodies kind of falling or like losing their form or dropping down or something like that. And historically, the other important reference that she's been researching is Japanese Buto dancers. Have any of you heard of that before? So you're nodding your head yes, which I didn't even know that element of the sort of source of inspiration, but I find it to be really interesting. I think I mentioned this in the preview a little bit, how I have selected these artists because there's a certain sensibility that I think might speak among them, but not because they're any kind of group show. But the fact is the Japanese Buto dancers